today. Okay. Thank you.
And we will actually. We'll There's bottled water there.
You say what?
There's bottled water right here. Yes. Good afternoon and welcome to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library with the DC Public Library System. My name is David Quick. I'm the Adult Services Coordinator here. I'm so glad to host this event today and to have you all here to hear from Jonathan Eig about this brand new biography about the man who this building is named after. If you've never been to this building or if this is your first time since we renovated, I'm glad you're here. Please take some time to walk around. We're very proud of the renovation. Before I hand it over to Issa from Politics and Prose, I do want to say thank you to the DC Public Library Foundation who supports us with these author talks, particularly with giveaway books. Afterwards, we'll have signing out in the lobby, but please enjoy the talk. And we're so glad to have the Congresswoman here as well. What a wonderful thing to have such a special guest. And I'm going to hand it over to Issa, who's going to do some more formal introductions.
Thank you, David. Hi everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Isa Salazar, and I am the subscriptions coordinator at Politics and Prose. We would first like to thank the DCPL MLK Library for hosting us today for this special event with author Jonathan Eig for his new biography, King: A Life, the first major biography in decades of one of the most prominent leaders of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. In this revelatory new portrait of the preacher and activist who shook the world, Eig gives us an MLK for our times, a deep thinker, a brilliant strategist, and a committed radical who led one of history's greatest movements and whose demands for racial and economic justice remain as urgent today as they were in his lifetime. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. Dubbed a master storyteller by documentary director Ken Burns, Jonathan Eig is the New York Times best-selling author of 5 books, including Ali, A Life, Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, and Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season. Eig's books have been listed among the best of the year by The Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Sports Illustrated, and Slate. Jonathan Eig will be in conversation with Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. Representing the District of Columbia since 1991, she is currently the chair of the House Subcommittee on Highways and Transit. Prior to her congressional tenure, she was appointed by President Jimmy Carter as the pioneering chairwoman of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. With a notable background as a civil rights activist, feminist leader, law professor, and board member at 3 Fortune 500 companies, she entered Congress as a prominent national figure. Her ongoing dedication to securing full congressional voting representation and democracy for the people of the District of Columbia reflects her lifelong commitment to universal human and civil rights. Let's give our speakers a round of applause.
Well, you can you hear me? You can see by the number of people here that there is great interest in your book. So let me begin by asking you what inspired you to write a book about Dr. King?
Well, thank you. Can I say, first of all, that it's just an honor to be here with you, one of my heroes, and it's something I never imagined that I'd be sitting across from you. So it's just really thrilled to be here. And thank you for everybody for coming out, too. And let's give a round of applause for our Congresswoman. The process, it was gradual, and it kind of happened organically. I was writing my book about Muhammad Ali, and I was interviewing people, and I was asked them occasionally. Some people knew about King and Ali, and they knew about the meeting. I was interested in the 2 times that King and Ali met, and I wanted to know what they talked about and how they got along, what they thought of each other. And as I was meeting people like Dick Gregory, who I interviewed here in Washington at a hotel not far from here, and I was interviewing Harry Belafonte and John Lewis and Andrew Young, I just realized that I had this amazing opportunity to say, what was Martin Luther King like? What was it like to be in the room with that guy? Because I was born in 1964. I grew up knowing him mostly by I Have a Dream, the national holiday, the national monument, and I think it's one of the unfortunate things about the creation of the national holiday is that we've turned him into a somewhat safe and two-dimensional figure. So when I found myself in the room with people who knew him, I just couldn't get enough. And I realized as I was finishing my Ali book that there really couldn't be a better use of my time than to travel the country, meeting people who knew King personally. And maybe I'd write a book. I wasn't sure. And then once I began doing it and realized that folks felt like we needed a new biography, because one of the things that people said to me very often, over and over, was that you don't know the real man. Harry Belafonte, used to sit around the living room with him, take off their shoes and socks and sing along to the record player, and that just intrigued me. The idea that that there hadn't been a biography, as the introduction said, it was actually 35 years. Now it's 41 years since between King biographies. That's just ridiculous. We need a new biography at least every generation for an important figure like that, because his story means different things to us today than it meant in the 1980s when it was published.
We certainly have a new biography. What were your thoughts and feelings about him when you began?
Well, I really must confess that I didn't know much about him. I don't think that I was ever instructed to read any of his works in school. I don't think even in college I read any of his books. And that's a big problem. When I visited the National Monument here last year with my kids over spring break, there were none of his books for sale at the monument. And I think one of the things that's happened is that we've reduced his teachings to some very simple platitudes. And I personally really didn't know that much about him. I went into this with a blank slate, really. And I came away feeling like in awe, really, over and over again, by the depth of his commitment, by the depth of his religious faith, and how he hewed to that his whole life, and how over and over again, when he was at a crossroads where he might have backed down, he never did, and only went deeper and deeper into his faith and pushed further and further, more aggressively over and over. I think that a lot of us think of him as a fairly conservative figure compared to some of the other civil rights activists, and I came away feeling like he was much more radical, and not just at the end of his life. Some people say, toward the end of his life, he and Malcolm X, for example, had more in common than they had apart. But I think all of his career, his too brief career, he was much more radical than we remember.
Well, did your books on Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali lead you in any way to Dr. King?
Well, they certainly did, and I didn't realize it at the time. But one of the things that I'm a slow learner, and I'm not a professional historian. But when I was working on that Jackie Robinson book, it occurred to me that Robinson, when he broke into the major leagues, Martin Luther King was only 16 years old. That he still wasn't sure he wanted to be a preacher. In fact, he was still telling his father that he thought he wanted to be a lawyer or a doctor. So think about that timeline of history. Think about the idea that King is still at Morehouse, still not even sure what he wants to declare for a major, as Jackie Robinson is breaking in with the Dodgers. And Robinson really, in many ways, sets the template for the civil rights movement, for the idea that we can force the integration of places that haven't been integrated. Robinson, King would later say, was sitting in and freedom riding before there was terms for those things. That's what Robinson was doing. So I think getting to know Robinson's world helped me better prepare, helped me understand the links between them. And Ali, as I mentioned, met King a couple of times, but they couldn't have been more different in many ways. Ali was going around saying integration was a waste of time, and mocking Martin Luther King, and yet at the same time, King really seemed to enjoy meeting and talking with Ali, which is one of the interesting things about King. He never seemed to be afraid to talk to people he disagreed with. I think he learned, and I think he liked listening to people, even those who criticized him.
Well, where and how did you begin the process of writing your book?
Well, as I mentioned, I began by interviewing as many people as I could. And I was lucky that I started doing it before COVID hit, because I was able to travel around the country and interview dozens of people who knew King personally. And then when COVID did hit, it was actually to my advantage in some ways, because a lot of folks had nothing else to do. So I could call them 3 times a day with my questions. People like Reverend James Lawson, I must have called him every day for 3 months in a row. And I just said, if you don't mind, I'm going to take a class with you this semester. And he was just happy to talk to me, and I was just so blessed to have that opportunity. Other people, like people who maybe aren't as famous, like June Dobbs Butts, who went to school with King in elementary school and high school. I met her before COVID and then just talked to her all the time during the shutdown. But at the same time, while I was doing that, I was looking for the new archival materials. There's a lot of new FBI documents that have been released, and in addition to that, I found private collections of documents that were really important. King had essentially a private archivist, Lawrence Dunbar Reddick, who was the head of the Schomburg Library in New York, moved down to Montgomery to teach at Alabama State, and just started documenting the Montgomery bus boycott, and saved every piece of paper, wrote down everything that was said at the meetings, wrote down what songs were sung in the churches, and he kept all of those papers, and they were in boxes at the Schomburg Library in Harlem that nobody had opened yet when I began this process. So when I found those, I found an autobiography that Daddy King wrote that had never been published. So I kept finding more and more incredible archival material too.
Well, was everyone receptive to you? Did you face any obstacles?
There were a few people who didn't talk to me, but really almost everybody close to King agreed to do an interview. There was Diane Nash said no, and Diane Nash didn't want to talk to me, and she's in Chicago. I live just a couple miles from her house. I called her. She texted back. She was very friendly, but she said, "I'm not going to do it." And as Rochelle Horowitz, another legend who I'll introduce later, knows, I'm very persistent, right? I don't take no for an answer. I flew all the way here to interview Rochelle one time, and she wasn't home, and it was a medical emergency, but I came back. But anyway, I asked Diane finally, and she said, it's nothing personal. It's just that I feel like too much of the civil rights story as we tell it revolves around King, and that has a cost, that it takes away attention from the other people in the movement who deserve to have their stories told. And another King biography, in her opinion, was only going to further that problem. It was only going to further distract from the incredible army of lieutenants who were working with King. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think that that the attention that I and others are giving King sometimes has a negative effect in terms of understanding the overall force of the movement?
Does attention to King have the effect of...
Does it diminish the work of others?
No, I don't think so. King is such a towering figure. It's impossible to think about the civil rights movement without thinking about Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
On the first page of your book, you call Dr. King a founding father. What did you mean by that?
Well, I wrote that. I gave it a lot of thought before I came up. And as you can imagine, that's the first sentence of the book. I probably went through about 1,000 first sentences before I settled on that one. But I wanted it to be provocative. I wanted it to be something you think about. Like, can you make a case that King is a founding father? Do you believe that the Constitution is a living document? Well, I think we can mostly agree on that. And if the Constitution is a living document, that means it changes in meaning. And when it was written by many men who owned slaves, and many men who thought that when they wrote all men are created equal, they didn't mention women. They left, some people would say that those documents were a lie at the time they were written. I would prefer to say that they were unfulfilled promises, and that King came closer than anybody, perhaps, to helping to fulfill those promises. So I think that if you consider the fact that the founding fathers, as we traditionally refer to them, didn't get the job done, and King came along, and the others with him, of course, but King forced the country to confront those flaws, to try to get us to live up to the promises contained in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and moved us closer than anybody had up until that point, then I think he deserves to be a founding father, and we can put him on Mount Rushmore. Who do we take down? Who do we take down? Thank you.
Well, you also say that on December the 5th, 1955, when King made his first speech during the Montgomery bus boycott, that, and here I'm quoting you, King found his voice preaching a mixture of political agitation and gospel, making the radicals seem reasonable, perhaps inevitable. Will you explain what you meant by that?
That night, December 5th, 1955, is really the night that I think King, as I said, found his voice, but became the King that we know, and sort of declared that the country was facing something new. What happened that night, Rosa Parks, as I think everybody knows, refused to get up from her seat on the bus. Over the course of the weekend, people in Montgomery, King was not one of the organizers. Joanne Robinson, it was mostly women, Rosa Parks, of course, Joanne Robinson and others started talking about whether we could, this is the moment that we should force the city to deal with the situation on the buses. Segregation in the South was terrible. The buses were particularly bad because it was this contained space where degradation occurred every day. You got on this bus and it was like a rolling theater of humiliation for black people. And Rosa Parks, not standing up, presented an opportunity. The people of Montgomery decided it was time to protest, and they weren't sure if they could organize quickly enough to get people to stay off the buses. They weren't sure if they were going to stay off the buses for one day, for a week, who knows. And they needed somebody to speak to the masses, gather as many people together that night, December 5th, and encourage them, say, can we do it? Is this the moment? Are we ready to fight? And King was new in town. That's really why they picked him, because he hadn't made any enemies yet. A lot of the other people who had been leaders of the movement, some people would follow them, some people didn't. You know how it is in any town, but especially in a smaller town, there's some rivalries. So they thought King, because nobody hated him yet, and he had a reputation for being a pretty good speaker, that maybe he was the guy. So he agrees to stand up that night and lead, and he's got 20 minutes to prepare for the biggest speech of his life. He gets home, tells Coretta, I don't know what I just agreed to do, but I got to go give a speech. He goes to his little office in the back of the parsonage, and he has a panic attack, as he describes it. 10 minutes, he can't even think. He's just, can't breathe. He finally settles himself, jots a few notes, runs out the door, gets in the car with Ralph Abernathy. They drive to the church. Traffic is blocked for miles around. King's like, what's going on with this traffic? Doesn't realize it's for him. He gets to the church, and he gives this speech that will really be the template for his entire career, because what he says is, he calls on the Constitution and the Bible. He says, we're not trying to burn down the city. We're not overturning buses. We don't want to overturn the Constitution. We want to join America. We want to make America better. And by calling on the words of the Constitution and the Bible, he's doing it in some ways, the most conservative, patriotic, popular way you possibly can. And this really becomes his superpower. It's very hard to resist, even in the North. Some people in the South might argue with this, but it's very hard to resist when you're saying, look, it's in the Bible. I'm just asking you to live up to the words you're preaching and that you're reciting every day, every Sunday in church. And he becomes this incredibly dynamic, magnetic figure, and it starts attracting attention from around the country. I was wondering, like, do you remember when you first heard of Martin Luther King? How old were you?
I certainly don't. It probably he's one of those figures that's been with you forever.
Yeah.
Well, tell me, did King grow more radical with time?
You know, the popular perception is that he grew more radical as he got older, and he began speaking out more on poverty and materialism and the war, of course. But I would argue that he was really just as radical all along. He was just a little bit preoccupied with things going on in the South, with the desegregation fight. But if you look at the record, you know, even as he's leading these marches in Montgomery and Selma and Birmingham and St. Augustine and Albany, Georgia, he's traveling throughout the North to raise money for the SCLC. And when he goes to those cities, he doesn't say, we really need you to help us fight those bad racists in the South. What he says to them is, I need your money, but you've also got a problem right here in your own backyards. Your schools in Chicago are just as segregated as our schools in Birmingham and in Atlanta. You're all running away from, you know, these neighborhoods rather than integrating them. He's calling them out, even in the early 60s. It's not just 66, 67 when he moves to Chicago that he begins calling out Northern racism. So I believe he was just as radical. But once he gets the Nobel Prize, once he becomes celebrated at the March on Washington, once he becomes a much bigger national figure, he feels like he's got more of a calling to speak out on, and can let that radical voice be heard more strongly.
Well, at what point did the FBI turn on Dr. King, and why?
Well, they began with the concern that he was surrounded by communists, former communists, Bayard Rustin, primarily, perhaps Stan Levison, primarily. Actually, Bayard might be the second one, the one that was second most scared of. But there were former communists everywhere at that point in America, including people connected to the White House. Why were they so obsessed with King? Obviously, race had a lot to do with that. But once it became clear that, so they began tapping the phones of people like Bayard Rustin and Stanley Levison, listening to King's conversations. Once it became clear that he was not showing any real interest in communism, that his goals were really to make America more democratic, obviously, they remained fixated on King, in part because by that point they had heard him talking to women other than Coretta on the phone. And that became a big hang-up for J. Edgar Hoover. And again, you can't escape the fact that's simply rooted in racism. The third piece of the puzzle, I think, is the March on Washington. After the March on Washington, King has brought America together more profoundly than it's ever been. There's really this moment of hope in America. We've literally watched black and white Americans singing in harmony on television. It's been on it, everyone has seen this, and there's a genuine sense, and reporters, white reporters even, are writing about this, that we might be turning a corner here in America. We might be ready to share the American system. We might be ready to share and break down all of the laws that have kept black people as second-class citizens. And right after that March on Washington, you get a memo from the FBI saying, he's becoming too powerful. We can't let that happen. We must redouble our efforts to undermine his work. So now it's not even really about his communist ties or about his sexism or his sexual habits. It's about the fact that he poses a threat to white Christian nationalism, frankly, is I think how J. Edgar Hoover would perceive it. And that threat is truly frightening, and that's J. Edgar Hoover sees his job as being protecting the existing power structure, and that means that certain people are holding on to the power.
Well, you don't shy away in your book from discussing King's flaws, including his extramarital affairs. And why do you think it was important to include that kind of material?
Well, I think, first of all, any biography has to be honest. If you want your readers to believe the great things that you're saying about a truly heroic, and I believe King may be the greatest American, period. If you want people to believe his heroism, his courage, his greatness, you have to be honest, and you have to include flaws. Also, I think it's important that we acknowledge that our heroes are flawed. We are all flawed, and King said this over and over in sermons, that God doesn't ask us to be perfect. He asks us to be as perfect as we can and to work on being more perfect. And then finally, it's important because King's sexual life became the source of the FBI's attack on him. And I believe what's most important is not who he was sleeping with. What's most important is the fact that his personal life was weaponized by our government in an attempt to destroy his marriage, urge him to commit suicide, and drive wedges between civil rights activists that would eventually weaken the entire civil rights movement. I think that's why it's important.
What happened when King tried to bring his activism to the North, and why was he less successful?
Now we're going to have to call out my hometown of Chicago and others. First of all, most of King's advisors, I think including Bayard, told him not to do it. Said, you don't know what you're up against in the North, and it's going to lack the moral clarity. In the South, it looked like, at least to white people reading the New York Times, that there were good guys and bad guys in Birmingham and in Selma, and it was pretty clear King had the moral high ground in those places. But when he moves to Chicago, literally moves to Chicago, rents an apartment North Lawndale, and when he starts advocating in places like New York and Philadelphia, the media's not with him. A lot of the politicians are not. It's not as easy to attack them as it is to attack Bull Connor. Mayor Daley in Chicago was the biggest employer of black people in the city of Chicago. Right, the city had tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of employees on the payroll who were African American, who were not going to march with King for fear of losing their jobs. And in a lot of northern cities, even the black ministers were somewhat divided. Some of them were with him, and some of them were against him. So King faced a lot more division in the North than he did in the South. And his demands weren't as clear. It's fairly clear to say we want to desegregate these lunch counters. We want to desegregate the buses. But in Chicago, he's calling for really profound structural changes. We need to remake housing structure. We need to think about how schools are built and where they're being built. The demands are a little bit more vague. But I will say, to King's credit, he had a very specific set of demands in Chicago, and he pushed Mayor Daley to agree to meet most of those demands, and they would have led to really lasting structural change in the city's economy. But as soon as King left town, Daley just kind of crumbled it up and threw it in the wastebasket.
Well, talk about what impact failure had on Dr. King. What did he learn from his failures?
I want to say, first of all, that one of the ironically wonderful things about the FBI wiretaps is that we can read King in his own words on the phone with his closest friends and advisors. And Bayard, by the way, said that the wiretaps were accurate. The transcripts of those wiretaps were accurate. Everything that they said took place in these conversations, Bayard remembered them as accurate. And Andrew Young said the same thing. Stan Levison said the same thing. The words in those wiretaps are accurate. One of the things that you really hear is that King suffered. He felt terrible when these campaigns didn't go well. He was very sensitive to criticism in the press. When New York Times and the Washington Post wrote editorials saying that, the Albany, Georgia campaign was a waste of time, or that his speech at the Riverside Church against the Vietnam War was foolish, and that he was unqualified to speak out on international affairs, he was wounded by these things. But the thing that always impressed me the most about King is that he just kept going. So, after what some people described as a failure in Albany, he applied what he learned to making sure it didn't happen again in Birmingham. And even when he was criticized, he said in this one conversation with Stan Levison, again, we have the transcript for it, Levison said, I think it was a mistake. The whole speech was a mistake. By speaking out so strongly against Vietnam, we're going to lose support in the North. You're going to blow up any whatever remains of your relationship with LBJ, and it wasn't good at that point anyway. And I just think that you need to look at the impact of that speech, because it's going to really hurt us for a long time. And this is one of his best friends, who he's known for a dozen years. And he says, don't you know me? Don't you know who I am? Haven't you been listening? What I did might have been wrong politically, but I know it wasn't wrong morally. And that's because he was a moral creature. He was trying to live up to the words in the Bible, which shouldn't be a shock given, his occupation before he became a protest leader.
Well, what sustained Dr. King during his travails?
God, for sure. Coretta, for sure. We should talk about Coretta a little bit.
Yeah, well, what role did Coretta play in his life?
Coretta went to Antioch, your alma mater, right? I wonder if you ever heard about her on campus.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, while you were in school even? Because she would have been out, less than 10 years at that point, right?
Yeah.
But people talked about her?
Yes, indeed.
Because she was an activist, right? Even on campus. She led a protest against a barbershop in town there that wouldn't cut black hair. She led a protest when student teachers weren't assigned to black schools. She attended, as a college student, the Progressive Party National Convention. So I've often wondered, and I talked to Harry Belafonte about this, why did King pick Coretta? He had a lot of dates. He had a lot of girlfriends. And in Boston, where he met Coretta, he was dating several other women at the same time when he met her. But he told her on the first date, I'm going to marry you because you have everything I'm looking for. And I think of course, she was beautiful and she was intelligent, but I think the number one thing that attracted him was that she had more experience as an activist than he did at that point. Mm-hmm. And I think even though she was often mostly relegated to staying home with the kids, and she complained about it a lot, she never stopped pushing him as an activist. She never stopped advising, and she never stopped really letting him know that she felt they together had a responsibility. And certainly after he won the Nobel Prize, it's Coretta who says, pretty much the next day, we have more responsibility now than we had before. Not you have more responsibility. We have more responsibility now than we ever had before. We're going to have to speak out on a lot more issues. We are going to have to really rededicate our lives to a lot of causes beyond the South in America. So I think Coretta is really one of the great unsung heroes in American history, and I'm hoping somebody will do a really good Coretta biography soon.
That's something you could tackle. So now let's talk about the process. How did you go about tackling such an enormous life story, and what surprised you most?
Well, one of the things that I did as soon as I even had the idea for this book, is I reached out to a lot of the scholars in the field, and first of all asked them if they thought another King biography was needed. Are they already working on one? Because I'm not going to step on any toes. And would they help me? Because, as I said earlier, I was not an expert on King's life, and I was setting out to become, one of the world's leading experts in a span of 6 years. That's not easy. But I had a community of other scholars who agreed to help me along the way. So as I was gathering all of these documents, and one of the advantages I have as a journalist, as opposed to an academic, is that I go digging through people's basements, literally, looking under their beds for files, looking in attics. To this day, I still haven't gotten into Ralph Abernathy's basement, and I'm mad about that and I just saw his son Kwame in Atlanta last week, and I said, when are you going to let me in that basement? That's what I do, and the scholars don't often do that kind of work. So as I'm finding these documents, as I found the Reddick papers at the Schomburg Library, I'm scanning them all in, I'm putting them into Google Drive, and I'm sharing them with David Garrow, with Peniel Joseph, with David Levering Lewis, some of the great titans who've written about King before, and I'm trying to learn from them just as I'm trying to learn from the people I'm interviewing. So I was really blessed to have this community around me. But I'm taking in hundreds of thousands of documents, trying to keep track of them all, trying to sort them in a way that I'll find them later, and trying to keep it all in my head. So really, for the first year and a half, I didn't even think about writing. It was just learn as much as I can, interview as many people as I can. And the question, what surprised me most, there were so many things. Some of the little things that I just loved. I love the little details, and this is one of the other things that newspaper journalists in general are trained is ask the details. Nobody had ever reported that King had a dog as a kid, that he had a dog, that he bought a dog for his kids. The dog's name was Topsy, and that he chewed his fingernails. That Juanita Abernathy's, I did an interview with her just before she passed away, and she knew all his favorite foods, and said he used to yell at the TV when they watched game shows. I just love those humanizing details. But I think, as I said before, the biggest thing that surprised me, without a question, even though it should be the most obvious, was the depth of his religious faith. That over again, he could have stepped back, he could have taken a year off, he could have said, okay, clearly the younger activists aren't really happy with me, I'll let someone else lead. But his faith would not allow them to do that. So he just kept putting his life on the line. After his home had been bombed, after his front door and windows had been shattered by shotguns, after he'd been stabbed in the chest, I think most of us, even the bravest among us, would have said, all right, I'm gonna take a step back. I still care. I'll advise. I'll teach. But it's time to let someone else stand at the front of the line, and he never did.
All right, this is my last question. What message do you hope people take from this book?
Wow. Well, I hope they take the message that King was a real person, that he was human, and that means that since all of us are human, we can all attempt to live up to his words, to live up. He never lost hope, and we live in an age when it's really, really easy to lose hope. And if King, in spite of all the suffering, could not lose hope, and that means he didn't lose hope in us, then I hope people will read the book and feel like, in some small way, they can carry on his legacy.
Well, thank you very much. There you have it.
All right. So thank you. We do have time for questions, and I wanted to start by asking a question of my friend Rochelle Horowitz, if I can, and I'll hand you the microphone. Rochelle was, as I mentioned, was the top aide for Bayard Rustin. Really helped do a lot of the planning for the March on Washington, but was with Bayard for how many years? Lots of years. So what I'd like, and Bayard Rustin, I should mention, I'll preface this. Bayard Rustin, when King began to emerge as a leader in Montgomery and began to get national attention, there were a lot of people who were activists in the North who said, we got to get this guy on our side. He's got something, he's got like lightning in a bottle. People want to hear what he has to say. We need to get him to make this, to work with us, to bring this Montgomery energy nationwide, worldwide. So Bayard Rustin was one of the very first to get down there to Montgomery. He finds King in his home and literally sees a handgun on the sofa cushion and says, I thought you were preaching nonviolence, Dr. King. And he says, yeah, but I got to protect myself. And Bayard says, we have to have a talk about what nonviolence really means. And Rustin becomes one of his most important advisors over the course of his career, but it's a contentious relationship at times. As I mentioned, Bayard was telling King, don't go north. Bayard, who was one of the most fearless radicals of his time, was saying, don't speak out against the Vietnam War. So what I'd like to ask you, Rochelle, is what do you think King most learned from Bayard, and what do you think Bayard most learned from King?
I think what is really important, and I remember, is that Bayard saw very early in King. I met Bayard when the Montgomery protest was already on, and he was, I was in an office, I was a teenager.
Back a little.
Okay. I was a teenager, and you can hold it, and it was amazing because Bayard was helping us put out mailings, and he would stop and take calls from Martin in Montgomery. Bayard saw something so special in Martin Luther King, and I remember him saying to us that here was the first black leader he had seen who could speak simultaneously to black folks and white folks. That Dr. King had a way of explaining the injustices of the society to white people, and also telling black people he understood and giving them an agenda. And it was Dr. King who managed to combine Gandhi's nonviolence and A. Philip Randolph's activism. And Bayard did see in him, and always saw in him, a oratorical and intellectual genius that he never saw in anybody else. I don't know exactly what Dr. King saw in Bayard. I didn't have that kind of relationship. But if you looked around, Dr. King himself was surrounded by black preachers. Bayard was not a preacher. He was a man of politics and reality and of direct action. And I think Bayard brought to Dr. King the world of black activism, and along with A. Philip Randolph brought the world of trade unionism. So Bayard broadened Dr. King's outlook. Also, Bayard had an international view of nonviolence, and it was Bayard who arranged Dr. King's first meetings in London with nonviolent activists. It was Bayard who introduced him to people in Stockholm and Oslo, and Bayard went along. I think it was one of these contentious but miraculous symbiotic relationships. And even in periods when they were forced to be apart, imposed a lot on Dr. King, Bayard never held it against it. Dr. King, you talk about it in the book, let Dr. King let Bayard go. Bayard never held it against him. He always knew that King was forced by Adam Clayton Powell and by forces to sort of separate himself from him. He was depressed by it. But the minute Dr. King called him, he was on the phone and back with Bayard.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Do you want them to use the mic?
I'm curious as to how you see what's going on now in the country, particularly in Florida, with the governor trying to whitewash black history and not wanting people to know about that, and having you say you consider Martin Luther King one of the founding fathers.
Yeah, well, obviously it's incomprehensible to me, except that I think it's mostly driven by politics. I don't think he's really stupid enough to believe that black history is not an essential, fascinating, important part of American history. I think he's doing it for political gain, but even whether he believes it or not doesn't excuse it. I think if you don't appreciate the fact that it's at the very core of who we are as a society, then you're not really paying attention, or you're trying really hard to ignore the reality around you.
I'd like you to comment on him as a writer, because I think Letter from Birmingham Jail is one of the great masterpieces in American literature, right up there with the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
And a lot of people use it in the classroom. I do, in that way. And I know you talk a lot about his education, but specifically, how did he hone that writing style, and how did he write that in jail with no references, no Zoom, no anything.
Yeah.
Off the top of his head.
Without a cell phone.
And then another question, has the family commented on the book, and how?
Family has not commented on the book. But to answer your question, I'm going to be really honest. King was not a good writer. He was a brilliant communicator and a brilliant speaker. He relied on friends to help him with his writing, and he relied on his unbelievable memory and his ability to recall what he'd said before in sermons and use it as he was writing, and to recall other things that he'd read, which often led him, unfortunately, to plagiarize. So he had people like Bayard Rustin, people like Stan Levison writing drafts. My favorite King speech, the Beyond Vietnam speech, which I think is one of the greatest pieces of oratory in American history. I admire the letter from Birmingham jail too, but that speech, Beyond Vietnam, he didn't write it at all. He coached the guy he asked to write it for him, and he read it like less than an hour before the speech, for the first time. And that's okay, because if you pick your 10 favorite presidential speeches in American history, I'll bet you 9 of them were not written by the president, right? King was a busy guy. He knew his talents. He was a brilliant preacher and a brilliant speaker because he knew how to combine everything that he'd learned in church, everything that he'd read in college. And Letter from Birmingham Jail is a brilliant synopsis of many of the books he'd read in college, sermons he'd given along the way. I happen to have interviewed the woman who typed it. Her name is Willa Mackey King, and she is still with us and had her, still had her Rolodex that she showed me from her desk at the SCLC. And she recalled getting those scraps of paper on greasy sandwich wrappers, on toilet paper, on newspaper. But whenever she would type it up and send it back, it would come back better and better each draft, because King was just a brilliant, I don't want to say editor. He's like a jazz musician. You know, I think about, Miles Davis didn't write a lot of great songs. He made them his own. And that's what I think King did. I think he made these words his own.
Hi, I have 2 questions. They're not related. You can choose either or both if you like. One is, and what you've written, so much of your work is about race and about writing about great Black Americans. And I'm wondering if you've ever had any trepidation or run into any friction doing that as a white person. My second question is about the revelation you found out about the Alex Haley quotes, which you could tell better than I can, the audience, what I'm talking about. And whether you were concerned at all that would come out before this, as you were consulting with other scholars, concerned that would come out before this book came out, if that bothered you at all, and just if you had any trepidation about taking on such a really one of the most well-known things that evidently King never said. So.
Oh yeah. So for the question of trepidation about being a white guy writing about Black people, I have trepidation about writing about anything. I was scared to death writing a biography of Lou Gehrig because I never met him, and I'm taking his life in my hands, and I'm supposed to tell you what really made Lou Gehrig tick. Like, I imagine Lou Gehrig looking down from heaven and saying, "You don't know what the hell you're talking about, fool." And when you're taking on a person from an entirely different culture, or from Black, I'm Jewish, I'm white, a Black Baptist. And one of our country's greatest icons, as I said, maybe the greatest American, period. The trepidation is off the charts. I'm scared out of my mind. But I did it because I had the opportunity, and I got nothing but support from the people who I asked. I approached very humbly and cautiously, asking first of all King's family, friends, other academics, and I was just given nothing but encouragement, so I feel really blessed about that. As for the Malcolm X, if you haven't read the wonderful story in the Washington Post, I discovered about a year ago, one of the things I do with every time I find a really good interview with my subject, if King gave a great interview, I try to find the notes from that interview, see if the reporter's notebooks, his tapes are archived somewhere. For example, I found David Halberstam's notes he did a profile of King in '67, and there's this wonderful detail in his notebook that didn't make it into a story where King was at the swimming pool with his daughter, and she scraped her knee. And she came running over to her daddy saying, "Oh, I got an owie, I got a boo-boo." And he takes a piece of fried chicken and rubs it on her knee and says, fried chicken is the best thing for a boo-boo. And I just love that so much. And, I wouldn't have found that if I hadn't gone through Halberstam's notes. And on a more consequential note, I got the notes, the transcripts of the interview that Alex Haley did with King. It's the longest interview King ever gave. And it's famous. There's a quote in there about Malcolm X that is taught in schools. It's been taught, it's in textbooks, where King criticizes Malcolm X and says his fiery demagogic oratory is doing nothing but dividing, and he's basically a danger to society. But that was not in the transcript, I discovered. And in fact, the transcript, King was asked about what he thinks of the Nation of Islam, and he said their fiery demagogic oratory is doing nothing but bringing trouble. And when asked about Malcolm X, he said, Malcolm and I don't agree on everything, but I'm not so arrogant to think I have all the answers. Very different story. He's expressing open-mindedness toward Malcolm, and the magazine, Alex Haley, or the editor of Playboy, changed that to try to create more conflict between these two men. And it goes back to what I was saying about the FBI. There's a lot of investment in the white media and in our law enforcement in trying to divide black activists. And that's what was going on there. So I was not worried at all about it leaking. I didn't think it was going to make big news. I was really pleasantly surprised. So I told all these other scholars about it because I wanted them to stop teaching that quote immediately. And I even asked like a couple of them, do you want to write about this? I don't mind. But the news didn't break until last week, and because I leaked it to the Washington Post, and along with my friend Donald in the back who helped me, and Abdul Rahman, who connected me with the editor of the Washington Post. Anyway, I was thrilled that it's getting some attention, and not because it might sell a few more books, but because it's a massive piece of American history that we've been teaching wrong. And if I can set that right, then I feel really pleased. Yes, Abdul Rahman Muhammad.
Hang on, let me get
yeah.
the microphone.
You may recognize him from Netflix.
Yeah, John, this may dovetail on this point you're making about this kind of caustic quote that's really a non-quote about King and Malcolm's relationship or how they saw one another. As you're well aware, at the beginning of February 1965, 3rd and the 4th, the month that Malcolm was assassinated, on the 21st of that month, he goes down to Alabama, first to Tuskegee and then to Selma, and he's not able to speak to Dr. King because Dr. King is in prison, of course, but he speaks to Coretta, in which he's trying to figure out for himself where he may fit into the civil rights movement, to what extent he's going to be able to participate in it or work with Dr. King. And that's like one of the great what ifs of history.
Yeah.
What if both of those men were allowed to live? We know they only had opportunity to meet once on Capitol Hill when they were debating the Civil Rights Act. What are your thoughts about that? What do you think? What do you think King's response to Malcolm, or let's say, if Malcolm was allowed to live a little longer, do you think they would have been able to come closer together?
First of all, let me say Abdul Rahman Muhammad probably is the leading expert on Malcolm X in the world, so I'm not going to say much about this. I'm going to let you answer. I'm going to say that moment is fascinating. So Malcolm goes to the church in Selma for this mass meeting and sits next to Coretta and says, tell Dr. King I'm sorry I didn't get to see him, but also tell him that I know what I'm doing. Like, maybe me taking this heat will make people appreciate that they should negotiate with you, that they could have it a lot worse than you. So tell Dr. King that in a way he's saying I got your back. And I mean, I'd love to hear the Congresswoman. What would have happened had both men lived? We can speculate about how they would have affected American history and how the movement might have been different. We can do a 8-part seminar on that. But just in terms of their relationship, it seems likely to me that they would have converged, that they would have at least had a chance to talk more. There was definitely no great wedge between them at that time. And do either of you have any thoughts on how you think that might have evolved?
Well, it is possible to see them converging. After all, they were both fighting for the same thing, using, albeit different ways of doing it. but you saw Malcolm losing some of his old ideology. If they had both lived longer, I think that the way in which they had begun to get together would have blossomed.
Yeah. And, Dr. King was losing a lot of his popularity at that same time, don't forget. And how does that factor into any possible, collaborations?
Well, the Congresswoman can tell us better than anyone that by the beginning of the 60s, the more conservative civil rights groups, the youth in those groups, especially on campus, were becoming more radical. And whether they were in CORE or the NAACP or Urban League, they were becoming more radical, and they were starting to listen to Malcolm more. In fact, Negro History Week, 1961, it was only a week back then. It was Black History Month now, obviously. But 1961, the NAACP chapter at Howard University they invited Malcolm to speak. They wanted to hear from him. Howard University, where, and I feel so embarrassed here in front of the Congresswoman because she, is part of that, she's actually part of the history. So I'm just a youngster, but that's where the entire legal strategy for desegregation was formulated at Howard Law School. Thurgood Marshall and James Nabritt and Charles Hamilton Houston. So there's no way in the world they're going to bring a Malcolm X to Howard University, who
Right.
was saying that integration is doomed. Forget about it. You're never going to be treated as an equal in the white man's society and his system. So, and we were making gains then. So by the time Dr. King, does that speech at the church in 67, he's becoming, like you say, he was open to the ideas of Malcolm, and he's realizing that he doesn't have all the answers. And we can say that Malcolm, at the time of his death, he was seeking some type of bridge with the brother, because he said, all of the bad things that I have said about Dr. King, and there were some bad things that he said, as you know. He said, I take it all back. I hope that he forgives me for all of the bad things that I have said about him.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And because I forgive him for anything he may have said about me, and we need to find a way to work together.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, Susan, my former editor at the Dallas Morning News.
And thank you for the tip to the Washington Post.
Now at the Washington Post.
We live in an incredibly divided society, systemic racism, racial inequity. If Martin Luther King, I'm going to do a perspective question, were alive today, what issue do you think he'd really be tackling, and how successful would he be in today's society and what we're dealing with? How successful would he be as a leader, do you think?
That's a really tough question. Thanks a lot, Susan. I'd like you to think about that too. What would Dr. King be most focused on today if he were with us? And he would only be 94. Harry Belafonte was 96, just passed away. And I think you might answer that question by looking at the career of Harry Belafonte, who never stopped speaking out, who really used his voice to say that there's a place in American society for radicalism, that we have to fight in the biggest, bravest way that we can, and encourage people to attack the very foundations, because that's what King was doing. His last attempt at sort of finding a way out was to mobilize the Poor People's Campaign here in Washington, and he was going to basically occupy Washington, D.C. until he forced fundamental change. And what was he asking for? Guaranteed annual income, guaranteed jobs, health care, anti-hunger policies. He really wanted us to consider a restructuring of the American economy in a way that would make it more fundamentally equitable. So I think in that sense he was going for the biggest, broadest issues that he could find, and asking us to really think about who we are and what we wanted to be as a country. And that, as I said earlier, when he was being urged to just stay focused on voting rights, he resisted that. He rejected that suggestion, saying that radicalism doesn't, mean choosing your targets specifically and taking on one thing at a time. He really wanted to try to do everything all at once, and I have to believe he still feel that way. I mean, you've probably been asked that before, Congresswoman. Do you have any sense for what do you think Dr. King would focus on today?
Well, he much of what he wanted to accomplish with respect to segregation has been accomplished, even in the South. But if he were living today, he might well be focused on the polarization in the Congress. And all that, because much that needs to be done now needs to be done there. King was inherently political, so that he would, it seems to me, have thrown himself into this polarization in order to get us where we should be.
All right, I think we should give you the last word. Thank you so much.
Let's thank Jonathan Eig and Congresswoman Holmes Norton again. Thank you so much. I will just say, so our friends from Politics and Prose, thanks again to them for being here and bringing us. Thank you. Follow their lead on buying books and getting signing. They'll do it right outside the doors. While you're here in the building, people that they were talking about tonight are in the mural in our great hall. Check it out. There's an exhibit on the 4th floor about Dr. King, parts of his life, like the Poor People's Campaign. So please take those in while you're in the building. Thank you, everyone.